Can some cameras pick up on the paranormal? Back in the late 1800s, an inventor named Frank Lumiere claimed that he had invented a camera that could see into a realm that humans could not. And what he saw, people at the time were just not ready for. And before we dive in, if you love spooky stories, you'll love the podcast. To prove it, he had set up a booth at the Chicago World's Fair where he took some of these portraits. The crazy thing about that day was that most of the portraits Frank had taken came out completely normal, but there were a few portraits of young girls that came out severely distorted. Frank was accused of all sorts of things, of being a con man, of being a witch, and then eventually he disappeared in 1908 along with his camera. History largely forgot about Frank and his camera, but recently a historian noticed that all 4 women who were photographed like this that day died before their 25th birthday. It's unclear if the camera had anything to do with it, or if the camera could see something that we just couldn't.
This is Sarah Boone, and she is a 42-year-old woman from Florida. And this is her boyfriend, George Torres. In February 2020, she claims that her and her boyfriend, George Torres, were playing a game of hide-and-seek drunk. She suggested that George Torres should get in his suitcase as a joke. He got in the suitcase and she zipped him up. Sarah Boone then claims to have fallen asleep upstairs because she was drunk. At least that's what she told the police. When she woke up the next morning, she found that her boyfriend, George Torres, was dead inside the suitcase. He was in there for so long that he obviously sadly passed away. Instead of calling the police, she actually called her ex-boyfriend. And when he came to the house, he told her she needs to ring the police. So she rang the police and told them everything. But she was lying, because when they checked her phone, they realised the real truth. And that was she intentionally locked him in the suitcase and filmed him begging to get out.
Hello. That's my name. Don't wear it up.
This is the most dangerous prisoner in the world, and you'll never believe why. A little girl named Shiloh was on her phone at night when she got a call from a mysterious number. And on that night, she didn't pick up the phone because her parents weren't home. And she didn't want to talk to any strangers. Thinking it might be one of her friends from school or her teacher, she picked up the phone. And when she picked up the phone, she heard a little girl's voice. The little girl told Shiloh to come to the park at night alone, and told her that she would play with her. Not knowing better, Shiloh decided to leave her house and walk to the park. The time was now 1 a.m. as Shiloh slowly started walking at night to the park. No one was around except her, and it was eerily quiet. Shiloh quickly realized that there was no one around her, so she freaked out and called the number back again. But this time, no one picked up. She was so scared she just wanted to see someone, so she decided to run to the park to see her friend that called. And that's when Shiloh's heart started beating really fast, because she heard a small car parked up behind her. And what happens next will absolutely shock you. If you want to know what happens, like and follow for part 2.
Today we are going to cover the secret life of the serial killer or killer clown John Wayne Gacy. Gacy was born in Chicago, Illinois on March 17, 1942. Gacy was the middle child to John Stanley Gacy and Marion Robinson and had 2 sisters. Gacy was close to his mother and 2 sisters, but had a really difficult relationship with his father, whom was physically abusive and an alcoholic. His father was known to call him sissy, dumb, and stupid. Gacy had a really hard time living up to his father's standards because he was constantly comparing him to his other 2 siblings. In September 1964, Gacy married his co-worker, Marlon Myers, after 6 months of dating. Marlon's father owned 3 KFC restaurants in Waterloo, Iowa, and asked Gacy to manage them. The twisted double life of Gacy started around August 1967 when he lured 15-year-old Donald Voorhees into his basement. His method was through alcohol and the promise to watch sexual explicit films. Go to part 2.
What are some of the craziest things that have happened to people while they've been hypnotized? I'm going to share with you some of the wildest stories I've found. And if you like stories like this, I think you'll like my podcast. On August 23, 1995, 2 girls in Belgium disappeared after being hypnotized. That night, they had gone with a group of friends to a hypnotist show where both of them were called up on stage. They were both hypnotized on stage, and they did classic hypnotized person things like eating a whole lemon thinking that it was a peach. They were unhypnotized after the show, but they continued to have strange behavior. Video footage found later of the girls at a train station after the show showed that they were still behaving very strangely. They seemed really out of it, like they were holding their bodies in really weird positions and walking in the opposite direction of the train. Neither of them made it home that night, but both of their bodies were found a year later on the property of Marc Dutroux. Dutroux was a monster who had committed this type of crime before, but many were left wondering if the girls being hypnotized put them in an extra vulnerable position for this to happen.
It's very easy to overlook the very thing that you're looking for, several times even. But what about when it comes to a missing child? Paulette was a 4-year-old girl from Mexico who went missing from her bedroom in 2010. Her parents initially stated that she had vanished in the middle of the night and a massive search was launched. However, authorities became suspicious of her parents' statements and behaviors, and 10 days later, she was found wrapped in blankets in her bed. The same bed that police had reportedly searched at the beginning of the case. What's even more crazy is that her mother had an interview in the same room that the body was found just a few days before. Her parents were charged with murder, but after a lengthy trial, were acquitted of all charges due to insufficient evidence. This case remains controversial, but many still wonder what really happened to Paulette. Thanks for watching, and drop a follow if you like the content.
Can you tell a place has a dark past just by looking at it? I'm going to show you some photos and we're going to see. And this is a series, so follow along for more. So this is a pretty inconspicuous looking building, but it's actually on top of what used to be the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas that burned down in 1993. For those of you that don't know, this is where the Branch Davidian cult led by David Koresh had a 51-day standoff with the ATF. It led to the deaths of 81 people, many of which were children, and the whole compound being burned down. And what's crazy is at the new location, you can actually see the foundation from the original building. And people walking around have even found charred bits of the original building on the ground. And this is what it looks like on the inside. Probably the most circulated piece of information about the Branch Davidians was how their leader, David, made it so that none of the husbands could sleep with their wives. He claimed that he was a prophet and took the burden of sex away from husbands, and so David was the only person that would sleep with the women. They also believed that the world was ending, and so you can see entrances to fallout shelters that they had built on the property. He and many others passed away in the fire, and in hindsight, the whole thing was a huge disaster. How accurate are reconstruction photos of unidentified bodies? Sometimes when a body is found in a condition that can't be identified, they'll build these 3D models just based on the remains they have. So today I'm going to tell you a story and we're going to see. This is the reconstruction model of Debbie Deer Creek, a body that was found in 1984 in Deer Creek, Montana. When she was found, it was Christmas Eve, and basically a wildlife photographer just saw her leg protruding from the snow. It was believed that she was a late teen, but could be as old as 30, but there were no missing reports of women that age in the area. And she remained unidentified until 2006 when DNA evidence proved that she was Marcy Bachman. She was a teen runaway who was a victim of Wayne Nance, a serial killer that operated in Montana in the 70s and 80s. This photo is actually of the two of them, and police had this photo, but someone had called in a false tip saying that they saw her in Seattle, so when police found this photo, they assumed she was alive and didn't think that she was one of his victims. When she was found, her face was completely unrecognizable, but you can see here, without any information to go on, they still made a model that looked somewhat like her. What do you think? So we know that the real story of the Little Mermaid is super disturbing. In the original Hans Christian Andersen story, once she's a person, she can't turn back into a mermaid. If she doesn't get the prince, she'll die. But her sisters find out that if she can spill the prince's blood, she'll be able to turn back into a mermaid. So they do what any sisters would do. They sell their hair for a dagger so that she can stab the prince. But in the end, she can't bring herself to do it, so she jumps off of a boat and disintegrates into sea foam. So it makes sense that Disney had to change that, but Disney's had to change a ton of other very disturbing details in their other movies. And just a reminder that if you have a dark curiosity, you'll love the podcast. In the original Cinderella, she doesn't get a dress from her fairy godmother. No, in the original tale, there is a tree growing next to her mother's grave, and Cinderella cries so hard over the tree that her tears water it. And the tree gifts her a dress as a thank you. And then later, when the evil stepsisters are trying on the glass slipper, they realize it doesn't fit their big feet and they chop off parts of their feet. And then they go to the prince like, look at the shoes fit, and he sees that bloody mess and he's like, they absolutely do not. So a bunch of seagulls come and pluck their eyeballs out. That's all obviously terrible, but the original Mulan might be one of the worst ones. I'm gonna do part 2 for that though. Okay, part 2 of the real horrifying backstories of your favorite Disney movies. And a reminder that if you've got a dark curiosity, you'll love the podcast. So like I said earlier, the Disney ending of Mulan is not like the original ending at all. In the Disney version, Mulan comes home after fighting dressed like a man and she lives happily ever after. In the 1634 telling of Mulan, Mulan comes home to find out that she's been summoned by a foreign ruler to be his concubine. And instead of doing that, she decides to take her own life. And then it just ends. Like, I imagine little children in 1600s China being like, what did I just watch? And another one that really rivals that disturbing ending is the original Sleeping Beauty, which was also from the 1600s, where everything was so depressing. So in the Disney version, it's true love's kiss that wakes Sleeping Beauty up. which is still not great, but definitely better than the original, because in the original, it's this guy. He was a wandering king from another kingdom who stumbles upon her body. He tries to wake her up, but he can't, so he proceeds to impregnate her. And then, upon waking up, instead of sending this man to jail, she marries him. But he is already married to another woman, so he burns her at the stake so he can be with Aurora.
The owner of this funeral home left suddenly one day in 2009 and never returned. Three weeks before, the owner had told her staff that there was something sinister within these walls and that they had to leave. She told them she had been working late and she saw the dead literally coming back to life before her very eyes. She never returned back to work or her home and was never seen again. The funeral home now sits, decaying and forgotten in time.
What? Look in there, mate. Look in there. What? Look in there.
Founded the Illuminati with the intention of establishing a new global order. I am Adam Weishaupt, a German philosopher and the leader of the Illuminati, a clandestine organization. I was born in the year 1748, and after completing my studies in law and philosophy, I entered academia. During this time, I developed an interest in Enlightenment concepts as well as the necessity of social and political reform. I established the Illuminati in 1776, a covert organization with the mission of advancing rationality, free thought, and learning. We supported the notion of a post-authoritarian society free from political and religious oppression. The tenets of equality, freedom, and impartiality served as the foundation of our civilization. Our society, though, didn't last long since, in 1785, the Bavarian government outlawed us. However, our thoughts and values persisted in traveling throughout Europe and beyond, influencing numerous social and political groups. There is still debate regarding and mystery surrounding the Illuminati's legacy. Some believe they are a dark secret society out to rule the planet. Today, it is frequently used to refer to a secretive clique of elites that runs world affairs. Although there is no proof to back up these assertions, the public's fascination in secret societies and the quest to learn hidden truths persists.
The story of this American female serial killer will make your hair stand up. As if her crimes are not horrific enough, she earned the nickname the Giggling Granny. How creepy is that? Nanny Doss was raised on a farm by a very controlling father, and one of the few joys that she had in life was sneaking into her mother's room and reading her romance novels, and she would daydream about the day that she'd be swept off her feet and have her happily ever after. And she got married to her first husband at the age of 16, and it was a miserable marriage. The couple had 4 daughters together, 2 of which mysteriously died of food poisoning, at which point the husband took one remaining daughter and fled because he was scared to death of Nanny. The remaining infant baby named Florine was left with Nanny, and Nanny picked up and married somebody new. Now this man was an alcoholic, but despite that, they were married 16 years and raised Florine together. This is where the bloodbath really begins. Nanny was in the room right after her daughter Melvina had given birth to her second grandchild, and while Melvina was still loopy from the labor drugs and she was exhausted, she could have sworn that she saw Nanny stick a hat pin in the baby's head. Melvina kind of passed out and went back to sleep, but when she came to, she started asking her family members, did Nanny have a hat pin and stick the baby in the head? And the family regretted to inform Melvina that the baby had in fact died, and yes, they did see Nanny holding a hat pin. However, the doctors couldn't give a positive explanation for the baby's death. The death of the baby absolutely shattered Melvina and her husband, and they started fighting and drifting apart, and Melvina started dating a soldier named Robert, who Nanny did not approve of. And one night when Melvina was out of the house and Robert was left alone with Nanny, Robert mysteriously died, and Nanny received $500 in life insurance that she had taken out on Robert a couple weeks earlier. Not long after that, Nanny's husband forced himself on her, and she didn't like that, so she put rat poison in his corn whiskey jar, and he died that night. Nanny married her third husband only 3 days after meeting him, and he died shortly after this of heart failure. She picked up some life insurance, bought some land, and built a new house. Her late third husband left behind a mother and a bedridden sister who also died shortly after. At this point, Nanny burned the house down, took that life insurance money, and moved on. Then Nanny landed a fourth husband, and at this point her mom moved in with him. She found out that her husband was cheating, so she poisoned him to death, and for good measure, she poisoned her mom to death too. Then she married her a fifth man named Samuel Doss, who was very disapproving of the romance novels that she loved to read. He went to the hospital one night with flu-like symptoms and was diagnosed with a severe digestive tract infection. He was treated and sent home. And a few days later, he showed up dead. The doctors were very suspicious of this, so they did an autopsy and found enough arsenic in his system to kill 20 men. Nanny was arrested shortly after this and confessed to killing 4 of her husbands, her mother-in-law, her mother, her sister, her sister-in-law, and yes, sadly, even the baby with the hat pin.
I bagged my victims, flattened them with a rolling pin, and drowned them in brownie batter. I am Thomas Linwood, known as the Muffin Man, and I am regarded as the first documented serial killer. I was born in Yorkshire, England. My father was a local baker at the Utility Muffin Research Kitchen. He was a respectable man, but at home he was a cruel master. I can still remember the day when his iron spatula, his trusted tool to create pastries, became the tool he used to torment the son who trusts him with his life. He didn't stop there. When he was done hitting me, he abused me sexually. He got a pastry bag covering my face with it, and even though I tried my best to fight for a breath of fresh air, all I could inhale was particles of flour and my tears. Like a dough of pastry, he kneaded several parts of my body, added butter, and inserted muffins, a specialty to any part of me where it fits. After he was done, he always gave me one of his muffins to keep me from crying. Growing up from an abusive childhood, all I wanted to do in my life is revenge, to feel what my father felt whenever he abused me, and to be able to be on the other end of that iron spatula. When I was 15 years old, I started raping peasants until it was banned by King Henry VIII. Given all I knew was baking, I opened a very unpopular shop. People complained about too much cyanide or too many glass shards in their pastries. But the bakery was popular among children and chock full of sugar. They ran around, playing and being a nuisance. To stop the children from coming to my shop, I started luring them by using a muffin on a string, pulling them closer inch by until I could get a hold of them, and beating the life out of them using a wooden spoon. Parents began teaching their children a song about the Muffin Man so they would not fall victim to the muffins I used as bait. To maintain my business, I needed to get rid of my competition. Chef Randall drowned in my brownie batter. Chef William was beaten until his face was no longer recognizable. Chef Carver experienced his mind-blowing matchlock. Chef George was flattened by my trusted rolling pin. Chef David was baked until he was golden brown. Chef Aaron was shaped and baked, and Chef Adam was crushed into a mortar, which became one of tastiest ingredient of my pastries. I was eventually caught by the police after the suspicion of the death of Chef Adam was my doing. I was arrested but free to leave as no one could prove anything. On the way back, an angry mob got their hands on me and pummeled me. During dinner that evening, I stabbed myself with a fork instead of a cockroach, making me scream and choke on the dumpling in my mouth, which caused my death.